Get started. We're still missing a couple folks, but they'll join us when they join us. We've got, don't want to keep people waiting. First item on the agenda, are there any requests for bill introductions today? All right, seeing none. You want to see how that plays out, Representative?
We ought to introduce the representative.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So I'll go ahead and do that. Thank you, John, for saying that. Some of you may or may not be aware that one of our colleagues had an accident yesterday, and as I understand, it's going to be a significant health challenge for him. So for those of you that are willing to say a prayer for Representative Heiberger, that would certainly be appreciated, or at least keep him in your thoughts. As a result of that, we now have the great and illustrious Representative Henry Helgerson as part of our committee. And we're grateful to have him here and thankful for his willingness to add to your load, sir. Thank you. Yeah, something like that. Anyway, thank you very much. Moving on. So what we're going to talk about today is the bill we passed last year, House Bill 2021, which was some reforms to the juvenile justice system. As part of that bill that we passed, it required an annual report on implementation. And so I have asked Natalie to just give us an overview of the changes that we made in 2021, and then we'll hear from the Kansas Department of Corrections on the implementation of that bill. So Natalie, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So last year, as the chairman indicated, you guys passed House Bill 2021. That bill became law on July 1st of 2023. The bill requires the Secretary for Children and Families to assess certain children. And then the Secretary of Corrections is required to provide certain services to juveniles while they're in a detention facility. It also changes the criteria used to refer and admit juveniles to juvenile crisis intervention centers, and allows money in the evidence-based programs account to be used on the children who are assessed in that new section. And then finally, the bill requires the Department of Corrections to build data systems for sharing information, and it allows the case length limits to be extended for certain juvenile offenders. So I'll go ahead and get into the details. Section 1 created a new section that requires the Secretary for Children and Families to identify an evidence-based risk and needs assessment to administer to children during the course of a child in need of care proceeding. If those children have been identified as exhibiting behavior that could lead to juvenile offender charges related to physical violence, aggression, damage to property, or use of life-threatening drugs. The results of that assessment would be part of the child's official file, so they couldn't be admitted into evidence during any proceeding under the Juvenile Justice Code, any juvenile offender proceeding. The Secretary is required to collaborate with the Secretary of Corrections to allow those children to participate in the evidence-based programming that's offered by the Department of Corrections that would traditionally be for juvenile offender youth. The Secretary of Corrections, or the Secretary for Children and Families, is required to identify that assessment before October 1st of 2023. So they should have identified that assessment by now. And then they were required to report to the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight before January 1st, 2024. Section 2 created a new section that required the Secretary of Corrections to ensure that juveniles who were held in detention centers first receive a risk and needs assessment or update their existing assessment within 72 hours, receive an updated or completed case plan within 48 hours after that risk and needs assessment is conducted, and 3, have access to behavioral health services while they're in detention. They're also required to have access to mental health services and substance use treatment disorder services. The Secretary is required to collaborate with other state agencies to provide those services while those youth are in detention. And they're required to collect data on the services that are provided and report to the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight before July 1st of each year. Section 3, amended KSA 382202, that's the definition section in the SYNC code. We're adding the definition of behavioral health crisis there, which is defined as behavioral and conduct issues that impact the safety or health of a child, members of the child's household or family, or members of the community, including but not limited to non-life-threatening mental health and substance abuse concerns. That definition is used throughout this legislation, throughout both the SINC code and the juvenile offender code, to replace the definition of mental health crisis, which used to be the criteria for admitting juveniles into juvenile crisis intervention centers. Section 4 amends KSA 382203. That's the jurisdiction statute in the SINC code. Essentially, that is just amended to provide that if children are eligible to receive services from the Department for Children and Families, the Department of Corrections, or the judicial branch, then all those agencies are required to collaborate to provide those services. And section, I was trying to find the section 8 is the identical provision that we're putting in the juvenile justice code. So that way those two match. No matter if a kid is SINC, juvenile offender, they should be getting those services. Section 5 amended KSA 382231. That's the statute in the SINC code that governs when a law enforcement officer can take a child into custody. And essentially, they just changed that to if the officer believes that a child is experiencing a behavioral health crisis, used to be a mental health crisis. Section 6 amended KSA 382243, the temporary custody statute. That just authorizes the court to enter a temporary custody order when there's probable cause to believe that the child is experiencing a behavioral health crisis. Again, used to be a mental health crisis. Section 7 just amends the definition section in the juvenile offender code to remove that definition of mental health crisis and put a definition of behavioral health crisis that matches the rest of the legislation. So we talked about section 8. So section 9 amended KSA 382330. That's the statute in the juvenile offender code that governs what happens after a law enforcement officer takes a juvenile into custody. So the officer, one of those options is to deliver the juvenile to a juvenile crisis intervention center. This is only going to be an option when the juvenile is experiencing a behavioral health crisis. Again, before it was a mental health crisis. Section 10 amended KSA 382391. That's the statute that provides sentencing alternatives under the juvenile offender code. That section is amended to provide that the court can extend the overall case length limit to allow juveniles to complete evidence-based programs when the failure to complete the program is due to a repeated intentional effort to delay by the juvenile as reported by the evidence-based services provider. Those extensions can only be granted incrementally. You may recall that before this legislation, the probation length limit was allowed to be extended, but not the overall case length limit. So this would allow the overall case length limit to be extended to finish probation. Section 11 amended KSA 382392. That's the statute that requires the statewide system of community-based graduated responses to probation violations. And this is amended to provide that the court services officer or community corrections officer has to immediately notify the court of a violation of probation, conditional release, or a condition of sentence. It also requires that when a juvenile is placed on probation, a judge can commit the juvenile to detention for a violation or for contempt of court if the judge makes a finding that the juvenile is demonstrating escalating use of physical violence, aggression, weapons, damage to property, or life-threatening substances. That juvenile can be placed in detention up to 24 hours for a first violation, up to 48 hours for a second violation, and up to 15 days on their third or subsequent violation. Section 12 amended KSA 65536. That's the statute that actually created the juvenile crisis intervention centers. And so we're just changing that terminology to be related to juveniles who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis instead of a mental health crisis. Section 13 amended KSA 7552162. That's the statute that requires the Department of Corrections and the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee to explore methods for exchanging confidential data across all the data systems. So that statute was required to say that the Department of Corrections before July 1st, 2025 has to develop a system to actually facilitate the exchange of that data. It also authorizes the department to contract with another entity in order to carry out that duty. Section 14, amended KSA 7552-164, that's the statute that creates the evidence-based programs account in the state general fund. The statute was amended to allow money in the fund to be used for the children who are assessed under the new Section 1 as experiencing aggressive offender-like behavior by the Secretary for Children and Families. So that way those children can receive programming before they get into the juvenile offender system. It also allows that money in that fund to be used for services that are provided by community mental health centers, community health centers, the Youth Advocate Program, Jobs for America's Graduates, Kansas Transition Services, and any other community-based service providers who offer evidence-based programming. Expenditures from that account are required to be made promptly and on a rolling basis. The statute was also amended to require the Secretary of Corrections to develop a grant program to implement evidence-based community programs and promising practices throughout the state. That would be subject to the availability of funding after the expenditures for the evidence-based programs are made. And any provider of evidence-based community programs can apply for that grant, and then the program is required to prioritize the money to go to areas where there's a low availability of community-based programs for juvenile offenders. One final thing on that is that child welfare case management providers are not eligible to receive grant funding under that statute. And that is it. I can take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Natalie. Committee, are there questions for Natalie about the bill that we passed last year? Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, now we'll be pleased to hear from Megan Milner, Deputy Secretary of Adult and Juvenile Community-Based Services, Kansas Department of Corrections. Megan, thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. I am Megan Milner with the Kansas Department of Corrections. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Juvenile and Adult Community-Based Services. I've tried to figure out an acronym that would shorten the title. I've not found one yet. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about House Bill 2021 and our implementation efforts so far. KSA 75-52-162 required that we submit a report on implementation efforts of the bill, which I believe you should have before you as part of our submitted testimony. My plan this afternoon was to walk through the sections of the bill where there has been progress. There are some sections that really don't require DOC action, and so I was going to skip through those, but I'm more than happy to talk through some of that if you would like to do that. So I'll start with section 1. Which, as you just heard, requires that the Department for Children and Families implement an evidence-based risk assessment for a youth who are in a child in need of care proceeding who have been identified as exhibiting behaviors that could lead to juvenile offender charges. So this was really, this section was really a DCF, Department for Children and Families function. But DCF did reach out to the Department of Corrections to engage us in some discussion and some partnership around this area. We were able to provide some feedback on available risk and need tools that could be used for this purpose. Ultimately, this was a DCF decision. They chose the Child and Adolescent Functional Assessment Scale, or the CAFAS, as their tool. And I believe that this was already a tool they were using in their system, so there wasn't necessarily a new implementation or rollout. There was a group formed to provide input on what tool was selected, and that group consisted of DCF staff, Department of Corrections staff, Community Corrections staff, and foster care case management agency staff. So we collaborated together and provided some feedback on what tool would be appropriate. I mention this because this group continues to meet. We've been meeting periodically just to troubleshoot issues that may be coming up around the tool or implementation of this process. And then I'm going to reference this section again when we get to section 14 of the bill, because the first and the last sections of the bill are connected together. Section 2 required that the Secretary of Corrections ensure that youth who are placed in a local detention center have a risk and needs assessment within 72 hours, an updated case plan within 48 hours of that assessment, and then access to behavioral health, mental health, and substance use services. We started engaging juvenile detention center directors across the state in June of 2023 in this discussion. Interestingly, I think it's interesting, the Department of Corrections does not have statutory or regulatory oversight of juvenile detention centers, but we have been providing support to them in a variety of ways over the past few years, so we do have a really great working relationship with those detention center directors. Based on the feedback from our central office staff and then the detention, yes, sir.
Sorry, would you hold on 1 second?
Yes, sir.
Vice Chair Smith, microphone.
Sorry about that. Would you help me to understand the 72-hour risk assessment and the 48-hour case plan? How does that work out? I would think the case plan would be somewhat reliant on the risk assessment. Can you help me with that to understand how that works?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, Representative. Thank you for that question. So how I understand this section of the bill is that within 72 hours of admission to the juvenile detention center, the youth needs to have that assessment administered to them. And then within 48 hours, they should have a case plan that identifies what, based on that assessment tool, what their needs are while they reside in detention.
I'll keep you from repeating yourself by interrupting. So it would be 48 hours after the risk assessment then is the way you would read that?
That is how we have interpreted the bill, yes,
Yeah, I think
sir.
you're right. That would have to, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Sometimes it makes sense to get the understanding while we're going, so thank you, Megan.
Makes sense. So based on feedback from our Kansas Department of Corrections staff and the detention center directors, we selected the Global Assessment of Individual Needs, or it's also called the GAIN. That is a risk needs assessment, and we've been working with that vendor to make some modifications to the tool. And we anticipate that we will be rolling that tool out in detention centers early this calendar year, 2024. Because a detention center may not know at the time of intake how long a youth will be there, one of the ideas that we're sort of tossing around with the directors is that every youth who is admitted to a detention center is administered the GAIN tool, which really just provides us with more information about those youth who are being detained and how they can better be served, whether it's there in the detention center or when they transition back to the community. Detention centers are working with local service providers to provide mental health and substance abuse services or to identify who those vendors may be. As you're probably aware, a lot of providers for mental health and substance abuse have also experienced a staffing crisis and have struggled with keeping staff employed. So we anticipate this being a challenge, but we'll know more as these services move forward. The detention centers have submitted budget proposals, and they were not only allowed to budget for the services, but we also encouraged them to budget to employ a care coordinator of sorts that would help coordinate services for youth in the detention centers, but then also maybe help as that youth transitions out into the community if that's the decision that is made for that youth. And hopefully keep those youth and families engaged in services if that's appropriate. And then again, we anticipate that this will roll out early calendar year 2024. So the next several sections actually do not require DOC action, so I'm going to skip sections 3 all the way down through about 9. Unless anyone has questions on those sections. Okay. Section 10 did not actually require DOC action. This section modifies the duration of a juvenile offender sentence to extend the term of probation, so the overall case length limit. We don't have any data on that right now. We're hoping that we can partner with OJA and maybe collect some of that information from journal entries, but there's not necessarily any action from the Department of Corrections that's been taken in this area. Section 10 is what I just covered. Section 11 requires that court services and community corrections report violations of conditions to the court, and then authorizes the court to impose a term of incarceration to a juvenile detention center in response to a violation of probation or for contempt of court. We did develop a reporting process for use by local probation officers to report those technical violations to the court. This was finalized in our standards for community supervision and was released in October of 2023. And then we also worked with OJA to make sure that the forms we were using between community corrections and court services were consistent so that there weren't differences for the court. There's no action necessarily required from DOC regarding the sanctions in detention centers, although we are hopeful that we can capture some of this through, and I apologize, I want to go back when I was talking about detention centers before. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that detention centers submit monthly logs to the Department of Corrections as part of our compliance with the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. So we modified those logs a little bit to hopefully gather a little bit of data on the gain and then on the services that youth are receiving in detention centers. And so we're also hopeful that in relation to this section regarding sanctions for youth that are imposed by the court, that we might be able to gather some information on that as well. So far, we don't have much data to really go off of for this particular section. One of the things that the 2016 Senate Bill 367, which was our juvenile reform bill here in Kansas, it added a provision for helping communities make decisions regarding the detention of youth. And so we implemented as a state the detention risk assessment or a detention risk assessment to help us standardize this process, specifically to help us reduce racial and ethnic disparity in decisions regarding detention for youth. One of the discussions we've had about the new provision or the changes in House Bill 2021, so prior to House Bill 2021, any youth who was being considered for detention would get a detention risk assessment, and that would identify current risk, are they a public safety risk, and help standardize that decision-making process. With the detention, with the court's ability to impose sanctions for technical violations now, those youth probably will not be administered a detention risk assessment, which maybe changes some of the intent of that. So I just want to make sure that I let the committee know that. I think it will be important for us to pay attention to the data and to how we're using those sanctions across the state so we can determine the impact that it's having on youth. I am going to skip by section 12, if that's okay, because there's no action from the department. Section 13 requires the Department of Corrections to develop a system to facilitate exchanging of confidential data by July 1. We have had 2 presentations from vendors. We have a third that we would like to sit through and explore a little bit more. And then we will be hopefully getting some feedback from some partner agencies like the Department for Children and Families, Office of Judicial Administration, and other agencies that might be impacted by a system like this. And then the last section, which is section 14. As previously stated, this section amended the current law on the use of funds in the evidence-based programs account to allow for youth who are in a child in need of care proceeding who were administered that risk and need assessment tool that we spoke about in section 1. So this is the connection of both of these sections. And also, so it allows those youth to be referred to programs and services that are specifically funded through the evidence-based programs account, including those services that are operated and run by community corrections, which of course historically in our state we haven't done that. So this was new for Kansas. And also requires us to look at rolling grants out of the evidence-based programs account. So first I'll address the grants. We absolutely understand the need to provide more funding opportunities for communities. We are working on that. We've had a little turnover in our grants unit at the Department of Corrections, so we're filling those positions, and as soon as those get filled, we will be moving forward with these new grant processes. One of the things we're looking at is quarterly grant opportunities, and then looking for additional ways that we can expand that to allow community partners and providers to access those funds on a regular basis. We also initiated some discussion with the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee on building some additional staffing infrastructure within the department to help us manage these grants, because we have a lot of grants that are coming out from the department right now, and it's gotten pretty difficult to manage. So we did create 2 additional positions that will oversee the creation and distribution of these grants. And then one of those positions will also be responsible for providing some support and monitoring the use of funds, making sure that the funds are being used appropriately, and evaluating some programs. So the other part of section 14 amended the prior language to allow a child in need of care who was administered a risk and needs assessment pursuant to section 1. As a reminder, this is the tool that was selected by DCF, the CAFAS. So based on the CAFAS score, a foster care agency can make a direct referral to community corrections for an identified service or program. And I specifically say it's an identified service or program because we want to make sure that any referral to services is one that that is sort of matched up with the need that's identified for that youth. With input from DCF, community corrections, and case management agencies, we developed a standardized referral form so that it was consistent across the state. That also allows us to track some data off of those referral forms. While a lot of this work has been happening at the state level, one of the things we've tried to encourage is discussion happening at the local level, so that communities are locally engaging with each other and having discussions about what services are available there locally and how they can access those services. So we've been providing some oversight at the state level, but we've also really been trying to encourage communities to build those relationships and communicate together. This process hasn't been without challenges, just to be honest with you. Research regarding justice-involved youth tells us to target moderate to high-risk youth for intervention, and by high risk or moderate risk, I'm referring to their risk to reoffend or the likelihood that they will commit another crime. Because that's really when we target moderate to high risk youth, that's where we can make the greatest impact with our services and our resources. And while the CAFAS gives a good indication for a youth's needs, it doesn't give us a comparable risk level. So we're just we're working together to figure out how we make those matches so that youth can get access to the services that they need, while still supporting community corrections agencies with adhering to evidence-based practices for justice-involved youth. So it's taking some, we're having to really work together. We're having to have lots of conversations and troubleshoot some scenarios. We also try not to mix risk levels in the juvenile justice system because research tells us that that can often cause more harm than good. So to adhere to this principle, community corrections agencies are trying to provide groups or programs that are separate for a child in need of care youth, or to not mix a child in need of care youth with a juvenile offender in those groups together. So in some areas of the state, that creates some challenges with staffing or capacity with groups. So we're trying to work through some of those as well. Some jurisdictions don't have the capacity to account for the number of referrals that they are receiving. So there are some challenges. I would say that in spite of the challenges, one of the things that I have seen is some really great communication that is happening. We've continued to meet with DCF and the foster care case management agencies and our community corrections agencies to try and troubleshoot and think through how do we, if the issue is access to services, how do we get the youth services? And trying to work through a lot of these rules that we've had for a very long time and for the benefit of the youth. We've also involved the coordinators at the Department of Corrections, DCF, and OJA. These are our crossover youth coordinators. So they are they're involved with the implementation of the crossover youth practice model. It's through Georgetown University. We've been doing that here in Kansas for a few years. So they've been a really important part as well in helping to facilitate this conversation. We are hopeful to collect some data. I think DCF also plans to collect some data. I don't want to speak for them. But I think that looking at the data regarding these referrals and the services that youth are able to access will give us an idea of gaps in services across the state. What services are missing, especially in some of our more rural or spread out areas where resources aren't as rich, maybe. And so it's going to be important that we take a look at that data and then use that data to help us make some data-driven decisions about where to devote resources or funds across the state. I believe that covers all sections of the bill, and I'm happy to stand for questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And honestly, that's the one thing I heard throughout this entire thing is the enormous amount of collaboration that's occurring, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would echo that. I think you've made it clear that there is new collaboration now, and maybe I'm hopeful that we've done some good in identifying holes and being able to put you all at the same table talking about these things. You can't provide everything as DOC. They can't provide everything as DCF. There has to be collaboration on this. This is a holistic approach, right? And I think SB 367 in 2017 attempted to get that, and we just have to keep working and see where the holes are. You guys are doing a good job, at least in this report. It sounds like you're doing a good job of identifying some of that. And I know it's a challenge. This is huge, right? It's a lot of moving parts that we're dealing with here. A lot of things that were bent or broken that needed to be fixed. And if we don't, and I know I'm going to keep it short after this, but the whole idea here on juvenile justice is that you can't point at one thing and say, if we just fix this one thing, we're going to get this right. Oftentimes, we're going to identify things as we go along and be willing to say, you're right, that might help. That might help. And so we need to continue doing that. So even if this doesn't fix everything, at least we can clean up some of it so we can see those broken parts. So I appreciate your report. It is very comprehensive. Thank you.
Representative Schlingensieben.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you say a little more about the crossover youth model and what it does?
Yes, sir. So this was, and Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you. So this was an initiative that we started. I might get the date wrong. It's been a few years. It was after the passage of Senate Bill 367, which was in 2016. And there was a discussion that was really bubbling up in the state regarding how changes in the juvenile justice system because it was comprehensive change. It was, you know, system-wide change for the juvenile justice system, how that impacted other systems, and specifically the child welfare system. And so there were discussions happening all across the state in a lot of different areas. And as part of our effort to try and collaborate, we partnered with Georgetown University, and they have this model called the Crossover Youth Practice Model, and it is specifically to address this issue of youth who cross over between systems, specifically the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. And it focuses on, one, how can we prevent crossover when that's appropriate? But when there is crossover and we cannot avoid one youth who crosses over to another system, what is the best way for us to identify the needs of that youth and family to service them? What we know from research is that youth who are crossover youth are some of the highest need youth that we could probably work with. So the number, I don't think it's a huge number in the state, but they are very, very high need youth. And so it requires a lot of coordination, especially between agencies, to work with those youth. Does that help? Wonderful.
Representative Mon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand there's limited resources, and I understand the need to focus on the medium and high offender or risk kids. But I was wondering whether or not you know, the low risk kids who are coming into the system, by not focusing on them, will they graduate to the next level? It's kind of like the broken window theory. If we just kind of, or the graffiti theory, let's clean that up, and it kind of trickles up the system. What does the research and information say about kind of not focusing on these lower level kids? If you have any information about that.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you so much for asking that question. One of the things that research tells us about low-risk youth doesn't mean that if a youth is identified as low risk that they're guaranteed to not go out and commit another crime. It means that they have certain protective factors in their life that make them part of a group who are less likely to go out and commit crime. So they have these characteristics about them that protect them and make them less likely that they will commit more crime. What we know about juvenile offenders who are low risk, one is that most of them, and I'm not going to say all, right, because it's not a magic wand, but most low-risk youth will age out of crime just by growing up. Their brain develops, they mature, they realize it's not a good idea to go steal something or hurt someone. The other thing that we know about low-risk youth is that they don't require a lot of intervention in order to impact change. And so when we say that we target moderate to high-risk youth, it doesn't always mean that we ignore the low-risk youth. It means that they don't receive as intense services or programs as some of the moderate to high-risk youth. Also, one of the other components of Senate Bill 367 was the creation and implementation of immediate intervention programs, which are diversion programs. It's another way to say diversion. And that's really where a lot of those low-risk, first-time offense youth are being diverted to, and hopefully diverted at an earlier point in the system where it doesn't cost the state as much money, as much resources, if we can sort of catch them earlier on in a diversion-type program, provide maybe a targeted, short-term, low-dosage intervention to help meet their need.
So when we define low risk, are these kids who basically have a support network around them, like they're in intact families, and so it may be taken care of in-house rather than, is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Mr. Chair, committee members, if I had to describe what sort of a typical low-risk youth might look like, it would be a youth who pretty regularly attends school and might be engaged in some activities after school that are pro-social. They might have some negative friends, but they would also have some positive influences in their friend circle. They would have, regardless of what their home life looked like, they would have a supportive relationship with a caregiver or a parent or a guardian. And so they have some of them, they're probably not using drugs. Those are some of those, what we would call protective factors that would make them low risk.
All right, thank you. So let me ask a question. You talked about the referral process, and it seems to be that's a bit of a cog in the wheel, if you will. Earlier today, and it just so happened that I was having a conversation about this very topic, and the individual that reached out to me to share the information didn't even know that we're having this meeting today. What are we doing to ensure that, you know, that referral process actually works? I know you mentioned trying to kind of let counties handle it to some extent, but it just doesn't seem that it's working very well. You provide any additional insight? And I actually shared this email committee. You guys all have a copy of this email from Angela Hedrick with KVC, where she kind of lined out just some specific concerns in that referral process and maybe some ideas on solving it. And I know that you haven't seen that yet, Megan, but just to bring your attention and talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee. So we developed a standardized referral form that just captures the necessary information that the Community Corrections Agency would need in order to identify what program or what service would match the needs of the youth. One of the things that we've worked really hard on in the juvenile justice system over the past 7, 8, 9 years is really working to make sure that the services that we provide to youth match those things that we know are contributing to their likelihood to reoffend. So it's a matching. We know they have anger management issues, so let's put them in anger management. We know they have an opioid addiction, so we're going to put them in anger management. So it's a matching. And so we need that information on those child in need of care youth to then appropriate either the Community Corrections Agency has a program or a service that meets the need that's been identified for that youth. And if so, then they would work with the foster care case management agency to then get the youth into that program when there is a spot available. If there is not an identified service or program to meet that need, then the Community Corrections Agency would be sharing that with the foster care agency to say, I'm sorry, we don't have a program that meets this specific need. I don't know if that answers your question.
It sounds like there's a disconnect between what programs are available and making sure that our, you know, foster care providers and others truly know, like is there a master list by county? Is there a master statewide database? Is there anywhere where these folks can go and say, this child needs anger management, here are the options?
And then the difference, I'm sorry to add to that because it was part of it, is the
Go ahead,
difference between
Representative.
Thomas County and Johnson County.
Go right ahead.
It's important.
Yeah, I understand.
Sorry, but
You're all right. Right, yeah, in those different counties, like on a county, is there anything like that or anything being talked about like that?
Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you. So there is not exactly a master list that exists. We do get reports annually. So that sounded really vague. We get reports annually from juvenile corrections advisory boards regarding the programs and services that they offer. And that is compiled into an annual JCAB report that's a public document. It goes to the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. That happens once a year. So if those programs or services change throughout the year, that's not captured until the following October, which is when that report is due. There has been a request that we maintain a master list for services and programs across the state. And just to be honest with you, I don't have a staff member to devote to that who can manage that list and update it and contact judicial districts monthly or as often as that needs to happen to update a list. That's part of the reason why we've really encouraged the local discussion between the case management agencies and community corrections. Because those community corrections agencies, they not only know the services that they provide, but they might know other services that are available in their community. And so that's one of the reasons why we've tried to encourage some of the local discussion between those agencies.
Yeah, I think as much as I wish they would take that initiative on their own, it doesn't appear that we're finding success in just that encouragement. And so, I mean, I certainly don't want to add anything more to anybody's task list as it relates to this, but I do think this is an important part of, you know, we've legislated that it needs to happen. In some ways, we've appropriated that it needs to happen, but we're not connecting people, which I think is key. And so if I could make an ask of you to provide just some kind of a framework, provide me a solution and what it would take to help solve this, whether that is another person that's dedicated to this and they make phone calls every month, whether there's a different mechanism. You've had so much great collaboration on so many of these different pieces. I feel like this disconnect is significant enough that we need to have some very intentional focus on it. And so if you wouldn't mind doing that and just put some thought behind what would that look like and how could we accomplish it and what resources would be necessary, and then report that back, I would really appreciate it.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. We can certainly explore ways to do that and collaborate with DCF and the foster care agencies.
That would be amazing. Thank you very much. Hey, we don't ask for little things around here, Representative. We go big, okay? Additional.
Big bureaucracy.
Yeah. No. Little government, big answers. That's where we go. Additional questions, committee. I think we've hit you with enough today, Megan. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the report. And everybody's very grateful for the work you're doing. We know we ask a lot, so thank you. Committee, just as I mentioned, that email from KVC was included, so everybody should have that. It was sent out with our committee documents today, where they just shared kind of some of those concerns. Also in your packet today was just an overview of core and coma. Planned on addressing that last week. I think we all understand open records and open meetings, but I would encourage you to review that document if you don't. One last thing. Jennifer King is here with us. Jennifer, would you step up to the podium? Jennifer is replacing Randy. You guys might remember Randy from last year. He retired. He's our legislative liaison. So Jennifer, if you'd like to introduce yourself maybe for a second.
Absolutely. Thank
with
you
us.
so much, Chair. Thank you, committee. I appreciate your service to the great state of Kansas. I can say that since I've lived here for 2.5 weeks now. I did take over for Randy. I know that he was a fixture here at the Capitol. I know that I've got some really big shoes to fill. I won't be exactly like him, but I'm certainly going to aspire to do as well as he did in this position. Just a bit of background for your information. I spent most of my career previously as a public affairs officer for the U.S. Army, and I actually have quite a bit of experience in legislative affairs on Capitol Hill on behalf of the Department of Defense. I spent 6 years overseas working as an international public affairs officer for the DoD. And I've also got extensive experience in private industry and working with lobbyists. So I'm very happy to be here, grateful for the opportunity, and look forward to working with y'all in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And surely you don't hail from somewhere in the South.
Is it really that obvious?
Minnesota?
No, I recently relocated here from South Arkansas, which was my hometown and area. So
Okay.
maybe I'll lose that accent the longer that I'm here, but I kind of doubt it.
Representative Carmichael had a question for you.
Of course, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to Kansas.
Thank you, sir, very much.
I know the standard of living and educational attainment is much higher here in Kansas than in the great state of
Ouch.
Arkansas, so you will have some adaptation.
Oh, man.
I thought it was a given. Seriously, if it's appropriate, what has become of our old friend, Mr. Bowman? Is he retired, gone somewhere else, or are you
Just
all able to
retired,
say?
sir.
Well,
And he left me a stack of documents about this high to get through. Yes, sir.
well, I think he's probably tier 1 capers, so I wish him well. I'm not going to comment about your retirement plan. At the appropriate time, could we get your contact information distributed to the committee so that we know how to find you?
Yes, sir, absolutely. The chairman has it. I'm sure he'll be happy to send it out, and y'all feel free to contact me at any time about anything.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate that very much. Put you on the spot. Great job, Secretary. It looks like you've done well. I'm really looking forward to working with Jennifer, and we certainly wish Randy well in his retirement. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all.
Absolutely. With that, committee, if there's nothing else that needs to be addressed, we'll be adjourned for the day. Thank you all.